Welcome to this week's Victoria 3 update, where we're going to be talking about two very important things. Firstly, addressing the elephant in the room for many players, performance in Victoria 3. What's changed both over the long run and also in the current patch, patch 1.2. Speaking of which, the second thing we'll be talking about today is how some of those changes to performance, among other things, play out in real terms in patch 1.2. What gameplay changes will we see, and indeed what has turned out to kind of be updateception, an update to the current 1.2 beta. Without any further ado, let's jump straight in, and we'll start with performance. Of course, some of the details here will be a little technical. There'll be time cards below if you get bored and decide to skip ahead, but what I'll do is try and present it in a sort of a plain English way, a way that you can understand, and hopefully I can too. And of course, the full information, the developer diary, will be linked below. Now, what they've done to performance is started off by describing what you need to know. Ticks per second is how they're evaluating performance. Unlike in some other games like your Fortnites or your Halo, where perhaps frames per second is really the go-to, inside of Paradox's heavy games, these deep simulations, they're looking at something called tick speed, and that's what we'll be talking about when we're looking at performance. If you thought patch 1.1 was slow, you should have seen how the game performed a year before its release, was what the developers told us today. And as you can see by looking at this graph, it indeed did change quite a bit. You can see that it starts around the beginning of 2022 and rolls through right until the very end. And across the board, performance saw a significant increase, as noted by that line falling sharply from a value of around 6.5 to around 1.5 at the beginning of 2022. Now, an important note, by the way, when they're talking about ticks in Victoria 3, a tick, a refresh, a check, crosses over every 6 hours. Victoria 3, there is a tick every 6 hours, or 1/4 of a day. That varies a little bit, by the way, from some of Paradox's other titles. Crusader Kings 3 and Europa Universalis 4, a tick is a single day. In Hearts of Iron 4, it's just 1 hour. And of course, also, not to bore you too much with the detail, but in Victoria 3 there are also yearly, monthly, weekly, and daily ticks to go alongside their regular ones. This is how the game keeps track of all of those things that are changing. And ultimately, of course, this is your performance. How many balls is Victoria 3 juggling and catching at the same time? And can it do them all at once? Many players would argue no. Let's move through then and have a look at a little bit of the detail before reflecting on how patch 1.2 has changed. In Victoria 3, a tick task is a distinct set of operations used to perform on the game's state, along with information on how often that thing should happen and what other tick tasks it depends upon. In some ways, you could think about it as the game communicating all of the different values it needs to track with itself, and then trying to keep that all running smoothly so it can present it to you. It could be the year in the game, it could be your construction queue, it could be the various different types of populations that exist and how they're changing. All of that information needs to, forgive the pun, tick along smoothly, and that ultimately impacts your performance. And for the nerds out there, you can see on this graph some of the most hungry, performance-heavy tasks that are ticking along in the background, perhaps without you even being aware. Number one is updating employment, by far and away. But you can see also here the top 10 offenders to your performance, and they're also color-coded, by the way, as to whether they're a standard tick, whether it happens perhaps once a year, once a week, once a day. Kind of interesting to note, but of course, a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Speaking of beyond the scope of this video, and definitely beyond my wheelhouse, the next section of the developer diary breaks down an optic capture of a weekly tick around the year 1890 in Victoria 3 in a release build. And I'm not going to go into all of the detail here. You are welcome to. It is linked below. But basically, the devs take us through how the game might break down or work through all of the different threads that it's dealing with to try and present the game logic to us, starting with things like the network and session thread, and moving right the way through to the main and then to rendering the game. Obviously, outside of my skill set, I'll link it below. They go on to talk about how efficiencies can be made or introduced, about how the game's performance has been optimized by looking at a variety of different levers. Does it need to be refreshing this often, and is it even calculating the right thing? They make some callbacks to the design philosophy principle and also to other Paradox games here as well that you might find interesting. In order to manage Victoria 3's modifiers, they decided to use a similar system to Stellaris, what they call modifier nodes. In essence, a dependency management system that allows them to flag modifiers as dirty and only recalculate it and the other modifiers that they depend upon. Essentially, let's do what we need to do and leave other things by the wayside. And that probably is about the level of detail that I'll go into there. When it comes to reflecting a little bit more about the actual gameplay itself, they shared a pretty interesting anecdote about how inside of Victoria 3, tick needs change a lot depending on the world. Luxembourg, a very small nation, while Russia, ginormous. Some operations are going to, sometimes, take more than 100 times as long from one country compared to another. Changes here allow them to identify specific parts that are essentially performance outliers, standing well beyond the standard deviation of the expected time it would take the game to compute, and then that allows them to schedule these outliers separately. For example, one instance, a really practical one, is by not having some of the game's largest players, say China, Russia, and Great Britain, all update on the same thread significantly at the same time. Changing this reduces the time needed for the budget to update, and ultimately, of course, improves our performance. And I thought that that was one really tangible and relatable note on performance as we now segue through into the final part, main section of this developer diary, the improvements made to 1.2. This week, they're fairly light off the ground. Of course, we've already dealt with, private economies, a vastly improved AI, as you can see by jumping into World War I in this gameplay, and a variety of other things. Honestly, actually, patch 1.2, a very significant update for Victoria 3. And of course, one of the changes has been to the user interface, the user experience, and this time is no different. The construction queue has changed a little bit, the interfacing behind it, adding into those performance improvements. As you can see on screen, the changes are somewhat simple, although they do help to highlight as well the private economies operating in Victoria 3. The new construction queue also operates much more smoothly, adding into the entire theme of this developer diary, really, and also adding into their next point. One big improvement to tick speed was a consequence of changes that they've made to the graphics update. Later in the game, updating the map, as many of you will know, can sometimes end up taking a lot of time, which in turn led to the game's logic having to wait a lot for the graphics to update. There's been engine improvements and changes to the game side code to help reduce the time it takes for the graphics to update, including, of course, in things like that timer ticking away up the top. There's been a lot of engine improvements as well to the code side, all in all, hopefully, helping to improve the threading of the map in the name update. Yes, I got that right. Optimizing the quote air entity update and further reducing the work needed to find out where buildings should show up in the city's graphics. So there's a handful of things that the game is doing a little bit differently from a graphical perspective to hopefully help improve the game. And indeed, in the evidence that they've shown, we can see around a 33% improvement to the millisecond time, at least, in changes before and after the graphical optimization was made. Under the hood in patch 1.2, they've made similar changes as well, actually, around the number of objects, total population, especially, and I'm hoping that this plays true, they make note of the late game, where we could end up with large amounts of tiny populations, making the, say, employment calculations or the employment update extremely slow. They've made steps to alleviate this by merging smaller pops together at the back end to help improve late game performance. Another thing that they've done is improve memory allocation in Clausewitz in 1.2. This time, and especially hopefully improving on Windows, we should see default allocations ending up being a little bit different, and hopefully this will improve our performance. They noted that these improvements contributed around 4% to seeing faster improvements over a year, about 2/3 into the timeline. And since it's an engine improvement, by the way, we'll likely see this rolled out to Crusader Kings 3 as well at some time in the future. And overall, all of this stuff that we've talked about in this video and the improvements that they've been making behind the scenes seem to have made an impact. Here you can see they've presented some evidence. Let's zoom in and take a look, and you can see that while the graph only goes up to 1871 or 1869 as it's labeled on the axis, so it is a relatively small tester. They made a note that actually it was the previous version of the game that was unable to with some stability, run overnight 1.1 tests. You can see that improvement has probably been made. Take a look. Release 1.1, the old version, is the line in pink along the top, and the new release of Victoria 3, 1.2, is that green line along the bottom. And you can see that from the start of the game, of course, while it's not really thinking about a lot, the improvements difference is relatively minor. As it stretches out across to the late 1860s into the 1870s, you can see that it is around 0.1 along that left axis, ranging, of course, from 0 to 1.0. Fairly significant, around 10, 20%, maybe even more, depending on where you're grabbing along that line. And I thought that this is hopefully sharing a story of good improvements for the player, of performance improvements, and maybe even stretching through into a late game campaign in Victoria 3. Let me know below how this goes for you. Is 1.2 working well or not so much? Very keen to find out because, of course, performance is something that differs wildly based on your system to mine and to Bob's next door. So please share your feedback. Thank you so much for joining me in today's update. And what is most interesting is what we'll be looking at next week. Next week, Nick will present on the various improvements done to the warfare mechanics in 1.2, noting, of course, that strategic objectives feature that we have already seen and already played around with a bit, and hopefully more new things to get our grubby little hands on. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.